Hi, welcome back to IndyCar on the 30th of January. One more day to go and then we're into February, and also, interestingly, into all the new border restrictions, taxes, duties and other inconvenience slowdowns of our trade with Europe, which are a direct result of Brexit. But that's not the main subject of today's programme. There are three subjects today. The first one is to do with the way the British government and the Scottish government were behaving during the COVID lockdowns. I'll come back to that in a moment. The second topic today deals with nuclear submarines, and in particular one nuclear submarine which has just been refitted. I'll return to that story shortly. And the other interesting piece of news today comes from Northern Ireland, so more on that in a moment. First of all, Michael Gove, or the cartoon character normally known as Michael Gove, has made some absolutely incredible statements about what was going on in the minds of British ministers at the time of COVID, especially with regards to the way the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government was handling the COVID situation, including the lockdowns. Now, we've heard a lot about so-called deleted WhatsApp messages. This is just another trawling effort by the British media to try and dredge up something, anything at all, which might paint the Scottish government in as bad a light as the United Kingdom government when it was in the middle of its lockdowns. Now, what's startling about what Michael Gove has said, and I'm only saying this is what he has said, what he claims, is that, and I'm assuming this is in his own opinion, but although it might be shared by other UK government ministers of the time, that COVID was of less importance and was less of a threat to the United Kingdom than was the risk of Scotland becoming independent. And this appears to have been the way in which the United Kingdom viewed the response to COVID in Scotland. That somehow it was more important for Scotland to stay in the Union than it was to save the lives of hundreds of thousands of people in the middle of a global pandemic which was decimating populations across the world. Now, this, I think, is an interesting admission because it shows that the Tories didn't care as much about people's lives as they did about preserving the Union. And it's a remarkable admission to come out from the mouth of Michael Gove, a man who is known for his lies and his evasions and his obfuscation. He's a man who can talk his way out of and around virtually anything. But for once in his life, I think he's actually told the truth, which is that the United Kingdom, during the COVID lockdown, regarded the Scottish government at the time and its competence in dealing with COVID as a threat to the Union. This is bizarre, but I think it goes to the mindset of the ultra-unionist Tory far right, which is preserve the Union at all costs, even at the expense of people dying from COVID, because it wasn't as important as the Union. Why is the Union so important? Well, I think there are two primary reasons for the United Kingdom's attitude in this case. One is that Scotland has all the nice natural resources which are coveted by the British state and which they ruthlessly exploit to make as much money as possible, whilst at the same time returning none of it to Scotland. And of course that has been going on for a very long time, over 317 years of exploitation and colonisation, and they want to keep it going. I mean, this seems to be the attitude. This is more important than saving the lives of people across the United Kingdom. And there was no more, I think, clear example of this than the differences in the approaches of the two governments to the way the COVID pandemic was dealt with. Now, no matter what you think of Nicola Sturgeon, and I'm not her greatest fan, let's face it, she did make regular daily updates on COVID every single day. Now, at the time, I thought that perhaps this was a little bit too much. It would have probably been enough to have made one of these statements every couple of days or every week perhaps, to collate all the statistics and to adjust the advice being given to the public. But regardless of that, if you compare and contrast that with the way Boris Johnson dealt with it, he would appear before the television cameras only when he was forced to, and only when he was forced to make some unpalatable decision about locking people down in England and Wales. and he was very reluctant to do it as well. Contrast that with the Scottish Government's approach, which was to take action early to make sure that people were safe, even if it was inconvenient and unpopular at the time. So I think we can see a very huge difference in attitudes to the value of people's lives when stacked up against the risks of losing Scotland's natural resources. It became very obvious from Michael Gove's comments the other day that he believes, and perhaps his handlers in London also believe, that Scotland's natural resources are far more valuable than people's lives. But that's not the end of the story, of course. The other reason why the United Kingdom wants to keep Scotland chained in the Union and not let it go and not give us any form of democracy to decide the matter is defence. And that brings me to my next story, which is that a British nuclear submarine has just finished a massive refit. Now, a massive refit generally means that a lot of the equipment in these submarines is switched out. Systems are updated, new systems are fitted. The cost of this, according to reports in the National today, was £500 million. That's £500 million. Now that is more than 10 times the average block grant that, sorry, I beg your pardon, it's not quite as much as that, but it's a substantial amount of money. I'm sorry, £500 million. Now it's a lot of money, £500 million to refit a submarine. It's a huge amount of money. I suspect that the British state is still clinging on to the idea that having a nuclear submarine somewhere underwater in the Atlantic, armed to the teeth with at least 16 nuclear-tipped missiles, each one of which can carry multiple individually targeted nuclear warheads, that is more important than actually defending the country in a traditional sense. Now, I've said a couple of times on this show that the war in Ukraine, where the Russians invaded using conventional military forces, conventional weaponry, has shown that deterrence doesn't work, because what happened with nuclear deterrence was the West was deterred from actually assisting Ukraine with the supply of the weapons it needed at the time it needed them, for fear of setting off some kind of nuclear conflagration with the Russians. The Russians, on the other hand, correctly, in my opinion, judged that the West would be too scared to help Ukraine, even with conventional weaponry. And unfortunately, Vladimir Putin was right on this occasion. The only people deterred by the deterrent were us. Which begs the question, how on earth would Scotland, and for the greater United Kingdom in fact, how would we defend ourselves against a conventional attack by Russia? Because Russia has shown already that it has an arsenal of thousands of missiles, not just intercontinental ballistic missiles with nuclear tips, but thousands of cruise missiles, hypersonic missiles, ballistic missiles with enough range to hit virtually anything and anywhere on the United Kingdom that they chose. And the question is, do we have enough missile defence systems to actually shut all this out? And I doubt that, because we have so many pieces of infrastructure that are so vital to the way this entire island is run, and they are all vulnerable to aerial attack by missiles. And yet we retain this single submarine to protect us from all of that, except we're not going to use it unless we are threatened with a nuclear strike. But what happens if we're not threatened with a nuclear strike? So that begs the question, why bother keeping nuclear weapons at all when they're so expensive? Even just to refit them costs £500 million. That money could easily be spent on something far more useful, like us, like the people who actually live in the country. And if they are going to spend it on defence, why not spend it on something that actually defends us against the kind of threats which are faced by the Ukrainians, which is obviously a much more realistic possibility than anything else right now. Anyway, moving on from Ukraine to Northern Ireland. And it was announced today, in fact, that the Democratic Unionist Party has finally, after, 2 years of going in the huff, has finally decided that it is now prepared to enter a power-sharing government with Sinn Féin, which incidentally is now the dominant political force in Northern Ireland. So they're going into a power-sharing executive in Stormont on condition that the United Kingdom passes new legislation which stops checks on goods which are flowing from mainland UK into Northern Ireland, but only destined for Northern Ireland. Now, to be honest with you, for once in my life I find myself thinking that the DUP is actually asking for something quite reasonable. Moving goods internally within the UK shouldn't really require all of these checks, because as long as they're proved to be not going into the EU, they don't really need those checks. So for once I agree about that. And the good thing about this is, because the DUP has finally been shamed into actually moving on this, is that Northern Ireland will finally get the kind of administration which it should have had for the last 2 years. Unfortunately, they've been suffering from a centralised administration by London up until now. So I would hope that with the efforts of Sinn Féin and the DUP combined together, actually working as a government, they might actually get things moving again in Northern Ireland. So Northern Ireland has, at a stroke, ended up with completely open borders, or it will have once these pieces of legislation they've asked for are put in place. It means that Northern Ireland will have free movement of goods, people, money, everything between the mainland of the UK and Northern Ireland without any let or hindrance. But at the same time, it keeps an open border with the European Union, where there are no checks, unless it is on goods manufactured in the UK going across the border into Southern Ireland, in which case there would be checks, but they still get to trade freely, despite Northern Ireland not being a part of the European Union, something which has been denied to Scotland, despite most of us, and I'm talking 68% of us, voting not to leave the European Union. So Scotland is a special case, but it's only a special case because we are strategically vital to the United Kingdom's continued use of nuclear weapons, even though they're pretty much useless, and also because they depend almost entirely for income on the money made by Scottish natural resources, and they are going to fight tooth and claw to keep us exactly where we are now. So I think we can say that it's rather shocking but not surprising to hear that the Tories value the Union more highly than people's lives during the COVID crisis, and that nuclear submarines, despite the fact that they deter nobody but ourselves, are being kept needlessly in the Clyde when we don't really require them. I don't particularly object to having a submarine fleet in Faslane. What I do object to is having nuclear-tipped missiles on board them when they plainly do not work. It would be better if they were equipped with an anti-ballistic missile system which could intercept and destroy incoming missiles, rather than shooting needlessly back after you've already been struck by a nuclear attack, which seems completely and utterly pointless, as always. And finally, of course, the DUP and Sinn Féin finally getting to govern their own bit of the island of Ireland, and in the process getting something which Scotland doesn't have, which is free access to the European Union. So here we are back where we started, as usual, no further forward in independence. The next general election, I would say, it is best to vote for a pro-independence party, even if it isn't campaigning for independence during this next general election. Voting for the SNP or ALBA or the Greens, fine, but just don't be voting for unionist parties. We're really just making it certain that we can't get out of the union if we do that. We need to make sure that it's well known that most of Scots want the union to end, and we've seen that from recent polls commissioned by the ALBA party, which showed that nearly 58% of us want our Scottish Parliament to hold a referendum on the union's future, and about the same amount actually supports independence itself. Anyway, that's it from me today. I hope you found the items in today's programme interesting, if shocking in the case of Michael Gove, and you'll be with me again sometime in the next few days. But that's it from IndyCar today. Keep the faith. Please keep supporting the channel with donations if you can afford to do it. I still have not got any answer yet from Facebook about advertising on this channel to monetize it. I'll let you know if I do. In the meantime, keep the faith, and I'll see you later in the week. Bye for now.